The year was 1982. Jill Montgomery, Raylene Rice, and Kenneth Franks were just kids 17, 17, and 18 years old. They had their whole lives ahead of them. But on the 13th of July, something went terribly wrong. They vanished near Lake Waco, and when their bodies were discovered the next day, the horror of what had happened became all too real. The crime scene was something out of a nightmare. The teenagers had been stabbed again and again, early 50 times in total. Their hands were bound, their bodies left discarded in a secluded park near the lake. The brutality of the murders sent shockwaves through the community. Waco wasn't the kind of place where things like this happened. Parents locked their doors. Teenagers who once roamed freely were suddenly looking over their shoulders. But the fear wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what might come next. Who could have done something so vicious? And were they still out there? Investigators rushed to find answers. At first, there were too many possibilities. Rumors spread like wildfire. Were the victims in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was this something even darker, a targeted killing, carried out with cold precision? Law enforcement scrambled to piece together the truth, but the deeper they dug, the more tangled the story became. Then, an unexpected name surfaced: Munir Muhammad Deeb, a local convenience store owner. His connection to Kenneth Franks raised eyebrows. But could he really be capable of something like this? And if so, had he acted alone? The case took twists and turns that no one saw coming, and what started as a desperate search for justice soon turned into one of the most controversial and debated murder investigations in Texas history. The Lake Waco murders weren't just about 3 tragic deaths. They exposed cracks in the justice system, tested the limits of forensic evidence, and left behind lingering doubts that persist to this day. Decades later, the question still remains: was the right man executed for the crime, or did the real killer walk free? This is the story of a case that shook a city, a case that would stretch on for years, leaving behind more questions than answers. A case that reminds us all sometimes, justice isn't as clear-cut as we want it to be. It started with a quiet morning by the water, a place where families picnicked, where friends gathered, where life felt simple. But on the 14th of July, 1982, that sense of peace was shattered. 2 fishermen, casting their lines at Spiegelville Park near Lake Waco, made a discovery that would haunt the city forever. Lying beneath the shade of a large tree was the body of an 18-year-old boy, propped against the stump. His name was Kenneth Franks. His body bore the unmistakable signs of brutal violence, stab wounds, too many to count. His sunglasses, eerily positioned over his lifeless eyes, only added to the horror. Just a short distance away, the first female victim was found: Raylene Rice, 17 years old. She had been bound, gagged, and stabbed repeatedly. Her injuries spoke of a crime not just of murder, but of torture. She was found nearly naked, a bra tied around one of her legs. And then came the last victim, Jill Montgomery, also 17. She, too, had been gagged, bound, and stabbed, her body left discarded like the others. All 3 had been tied with shoelaces, and altogether, they suffered a staggering 48 stab wounds. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through Waco. This wasn't just murder, it was something far worse. Who could commit such an act? And why? These were the questions that consumed the community and law enforcement alike. The first officers on the scene, among them Patrol Sergeant Truman Simons, had seen violence before, but nothing like this. The wounds weren't just meant to kill. They seemed meant to inflict suffering. Some of the stab wounds were shallow, as if the killer had toyed with them before delivering the final blows. Detectives moved quickly, piecing together what little evidence they had. There was no immediate suspect, no obvious motive. The victims were young, still in the prime of their lives, with no known enemies. Rumors swirled: gang activity, a drug deal gone wrong, a crime of passion. But as investigators dug deeper, they found something far more disturbing. These murders may have been planned, orchestrated, and possibly even mistaken identity. The case was officially opened with the Waco Police Department, led by Lieutenant Marvin Horton, Detective Ramon Salinas, and Patrolman Mike Nicoletti. But one officer took a special interest in the case: Truman Simons. A former street cop, Simons had a gut feeling about this crime. It felt different. It felt personal. As the initial investigation unfolded, detectives worked through the last known movements of the victims. Kenneth Franks was a troubled teenager who had clashed with a local convenience store owner, Munir Mohammed Deeb. Was there a connection? Was this a revenge killing? Then, an even more shocking possibility, a murder-for-hire plot gone terribly wrong. But for now, in those early days, the evidence was thin. Leads came and went. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. And as the investigation stalled, the real killer or killers were still out there, walking free. The city of Waco held its breath, waiting for justice, not knowing that this case would drag on for years, leaving behind more questions than answers. The investigation into the brutal murders of Kenneth Franks, Raylene Rice, and Jill Montgomery was filled with twists, dead ends, and unexpected developments. In the early days, law enforcement faced an overwhelming challenge: who could have committed such a horrific crime, and why? At first, the police considered several individuals as possible suspects. Among them was James Russell Bishop, a man who had connections to the area where the victims were found. Another person of interest, Terry Harper, was known to have been in Waco around the time of the murders. However, after thorough questioning and verification of their alibis, both men were cleared of suspicion, at least for the time being. As months passed without progress, the case began to stall. Frustration grew among investigators, but one officer, Truman Simons, refused to let the case go cold. Simons, who had been one of the first to arrive at the crime scene, had developed an obsession with finding justice for the three teenagers. He relentlessly pursued any lead, no matter how small, and his persistence would eventually pay off. A turning point came when a local gas station owner, Munir Mohammed Deeb, made a disturbing comment to two young women. He claimed to have been involved in the murders. When one of the women reported this to the police, Deeb was immediately taken in for questioning. A polygraph test, which he passed, led to his temporary release due to lack of evidence. Still, Simons remained convinced there was more to Deeb's story. It wasn't until nearly a year later that the investigation gained new momentum. Simons and his team uncovered information suggesting that Deeb had a financial motive for murder. A life insurance policy taken out on a young woman who closely resembled victim Jill Montgomery led authorities to believe that the murders may have been a case of mistaken identity. If true, it meant that someone else had been hired to carry out the crime. The break investigators had been waiting for came when David Wayne Spence's name surfaced. Spence, already serving time for unrelated charges, was rumored to have boasted about committing the murders while in prison. Further scrutiny revealed his connections to two other men, Anthony and Gilbert Melendez. These two brothers, both with criminal backgrounds, had reportedly participated in the attack alongside Spence. With this new theory in place, authorities arrested Deeb, Spence, and the Melendez brothers in late 1983. The prosecution alleged that Deeb had orchestrated the crime, hiring Spence to carry out a murder-for-hire scheme that had gone terribly wrong. Spence, in turn, had enlisted the Melendez brothers as accomplices. It was a shocking revelation, one that turned the case on its head. But despite the arrests, serious questions remained. Much of the evidence against the suspects relied on testimony from jailhouse informants, prisoners who claimed Spence had confessed to them. While some believed these witnesses, others questioned their credibility. Could convicted criminals seeking leniency in their own cases be trusted? And what about Deeb, whose conviction would later be overturned due to lack of solid evidence? As the accused men prepared to stand trial, the case remained clouded in uncertainty. The prosecution was determined to see justice served, but doubts lingered. Had police truly found the killers, or was there more to the story than met the eye? The stage was set for one of the most controversial trials in Texas history. The next battle would take place in the courtroom, where guilt and innocence would be fiercely debated and the truth, whatever it was, would be put to the test. The trials for the Lake Waco murders began in late 1983, drawing intense public attention. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Vic Feazell, was determined to hold those responsible accountable. The case relied heavily on witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and jailhouse informants, making the proceedings both complex and controversial. The first to be tried was Munir Mohammed Deeb, the local gas station owner accused of orchestrating the killings. Prosecutors argued that Deeb had hired David Wayne Spence to carry out a murder-for-hire plot targeting an employee who bore a resemblance to one of the victims, Jill Montgomery. However, the killings did not go as planned, and all three teenagers lost their lives. Despite the serious charges, Deeb maintained his innocence throughout the trial. The jury found him guilty of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death in 1985. David Wayne Spence's trial followed, and it was arguably the most pivotal in the entire case. The prosecution leaned on bite mark evidence found on the victims, which forensic experts claimed matched Spence's dental impressions. Additionally, multiple jailhouse informants testified that Spence had admitted to the murders while behind bars. The defense, however, argued that the informants had been incentivized to testify and that the bite mark analysis was unreliable. Regardless, the jury found Spence guilty, and he too was sentenced to death. The Melendez brothers, Anthony and Gilbert, opted for plea deals. Anthony Melendez pleaded guilty in June 1984 and received a life sentence. Gilbert Melendez followed in January 1985, also receiving a life sentence in exchange for his testimony against Deeb. Their confessions played a significant role in securing the convictions of Spence and Deeb, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that this was a premeditated crime. Despite the convictions, controversy loomed over the case. Years later, forensic experts began questioning the reliability of bite mark analysis, which had been a key piece of evidence against Spence. Additionally, concerns arose over the credibility of the jailhouse informants, some of whom later recanted their testimonies. In 1991, Deeb's conviction was overturned, and in 1993, he was acquitted in a retrial. He walked free after spending years on death row, leaving many to question whether justice had truly been served. David Wayne Spence, however, was not as fortunate. His appeals were repeatedly denied, and in April 1997, he was executed by lethal injection. Until his final moments, Spence insisted that he was innocent. His execution remains one of the most debated aspects of the Lake Waco murders case, fueling ongoing discussions about wrongful convictions and the reliability of forensic evidence. Anthony Melendez, the last surviving convicted participant, continued to fight for his exoneration while serving his life sentence. He maintained that he had been coerced into confessing, but was never able to secure a retrial. He passed away in prison in 2017, leaving the case with lingering questions that may never be fully answered. The Lake Waco murders trials left a lasting impact on the legal system, highlighting issues surrounding forensic science, witness reliability, and the risks of wrongful conviction. Even decades later, the case remains a haunting reminder of a justice system that at times may not have all the answers. The convictions in the Lake Waco murders case did not bring the case to a quiet close. Instead, they sparked intense debates, legal battles, and claims of injustice that would persist for years. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was the role of informants. Prosecutors relied heavily on the testimony of jailhouse informants, individuals who claimed that David Wayne Spence had confessed to them while behind bars. These informants, many of whom had histories of criminal activity, stood to benefit from their testimony. Some received reduced sentences, while others were given financial incentives. This raised serious concerns about the credibility of their statements. If they had something to gain, could their accounts be trusted? Beyond the informants, another key issue was the evidencer, as critics argued the lack of it. There was no physical evidence linking Spence or his alleged accomplices, Anthony and Gilbert Melendez, to the crime scene. The case against them was built largely on circumstantial evidence and witness statements that were later called into question. For some, this raised doubts about whether justice had truly been served. The involvement of law enforcement also came under scrutiny. Former Waco police detective Truman Simons, a key figure in the investigation, played an unusually active role in gathering evidence and securing convictions. While some praised his persistence, others argued that he was too personally invested in the case. His methods, including the use of informants and the way he presented evidence, fueled accusations that the case had been manipulated to secure convictions at any cost. The controversy only deepened when appeals were filed. Spence maintained his innocence until the very end, insisting that he had been framed. His attorneys argued that the prosecution had relied on unreliable witnesses and that crucial evidence had been ignored. One of their strongest points was that the victims did not match the original intended targets. If the murders had been a case of mistaken identity, as prosecutors claimed, then why was there no direct proof tying Spence and the Melendez brothers to the crime? Despite these arguments, Spence's appeals were repeatedly denied. In 1997, after years of failed attempts to overturn his conviction, he was executed by lethal injection. His final words included a declaration of innocence. "I am innocent. I did not kill anyone." For many, Spence's execution marked the end of a long and painful chapter. But for others, it only reinforced their belief that a grave injustice had occurred. Supporters, including some legal experts and journalists, argued that the state had put an innocent man to death. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the reliance on informants, and the doubts that lingered over key testimony. The Melendez brothers, who had initially pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences, later claimed that they had been coerced into confessing. They insisted that Spence had no involvement in the murders, and that they had only admitted guilt to avoid the death penalty. While their statements did little to change the outcome, they added another layer of doubt to an already contentious case. Decades later, the Lake Waco murders remain a haunting and polarizing case. Was justice truly served, or did the system fail, allowing the real killers to go free while innocent men took the fall? These questions continue to cast a shadow over one of Texas's most infamous crimes. The Lake Waco murders left scars that ran deeper than the initial horror of the crime. This case didn't just shake a community, it raised urgent questions about justice, the reliability of witness testimony, and the power of law enforcement to shape a narrative. Decades later, those questions remain unanswered, keeping the case alive in legal discussions and public memory. In the immediate aftermath, the case became a cautionary tale for law enforcement agencies nationwide. Investigators saw firsthand how pressure to solve a high-profile crime could lead to rushed conclusions and questionable tactics. The controversy surrounding the convictions underscored the importance of thorough, impartial investigation zones that didn't hinge on unreliable confessions or shaky evidence. The legal system also felt the case's impact. The appeals and debates over wrongful conviction highlighted flaws in the way evidence was handled, how suspects were interrogated, and the weight given to testimony from informants. This wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was a stark reminder that the justice system, when flawed, could cost innocent people their lives. Public awareness shifted as well. The case was a turning point in how the public perceived the death penalty and wrongful convictions. Questions about fairness, the reliability of convictions, and the possibility of executing an innocent person made their way into broader discussions about capital punishment. It was no longer just about guilt or innocence, it was about whether the system itself could be trusted to deliver justice fairly. For the families of the victims, the case left an emotional legacy that no court ruling could erase. Justice, whether served or denied, could never bring back their loved ones. Their grief became a permanent reminder of the human cost behind every murder trial, every appeal, every overturned conviction. Even today, the Lake Waco murders remain a subject of debate. They remind us that behind every headline, every conviction, and every appeal is a story of real people, victims, suspects, families, and investigators whose lives were forever changed. Whether the case stands as an example of justice served or justice denied, one thing is certain: it left an indelible mark on history, ensuring that it will never be forgotten.